Thank you. Well, hello to all of you. I'm here. Hello, hello, hello. Well, I'm here to talk about Carpe Diem, of course, seize the day, which is, I guess it's one of the oldest philosophical ideals in Western history and Western culture. And as some of you probably know, that Latin term Carpe Diem goes back to a poem written in 23 BC by the Roman lyric poet Horace. It's in his first book of Odes, Ode 11. And it's only 8 lines long. Can you hear me down the back, by the way? Yeah. So it's only 8 lines long, this poem, but its last couple of lines really sum up what that it was all about having the best kind of coffee you could possibly have. So his last couple of lines really sum up what it was all about. He wrote this. He said, "Even as we speak, envious time flies past. Seize the day and leave as little as possible for tomorrow." And I think in those words it really sums up one of the great existential questions, doesn't it? Like, how should we live given the reality of our mortality? How do we live a life without regret, with time passing by? And I think it's extraordinary that 2,000 years after he wrote that poem, that Latin motto, 2 words, is still extraordinarily resonant in popular culture. So, for example, it's not only the case that Carpe Diem is one of the most popular tattoos that you can get, but the British actress Judi Dench had Carpe Diem tattooed onto her right wrist for her 81st birthday. The heavy metal band Metallica has rocked audiences around the world with their song Carpe Diem Baby, which puts an erotic spin on Horace's ode. And then a lot of people, like me, first came across the phrase in the 1989 film Dead Poets Society, where, Robin Williams, as you know, playing the inspiring school teacher Mr. Keating in a 1950s New England boys' school, turns to his pupils and says, "We are food for worms, lads, because each and every one of us in this room is going to stop breathing, grow cold, and die. Carpe diem. Seize the day, boys. Make your lives extraordinary," which they go on to do, and sometimes not to do. Now, this phrase has its modern equivalent since Dead Poets Society's come along. There's been Nike's slogan, "Just Do It." There's the Twitter hashtag YOLO, you only live once. But it's Carpe Diem which really remains dominant. You Google it, you get 25 million search results. And I think it's an important ideal today because we live in an age of distraction. And Carpe Diem is the antidote. We live in a state of continuous partial attention, with the average person checks their phone on 110 times a day. We become spectators of life on the screen rather than living it directly ourselves. The problem, though, is that though Carpe Diem is an antidote to this age of distraction, the spirit of seizing the day and Horace's ideal, I believe, has been hijacked. It's been hijacked by consumer culture. It's been hijacked even by the mindfulness movement. You wouldn't think something as benign as mindfulness would be a problem, but I think it is for Carpe Diem. And the Carpe Diem, it's part of the Carpe Diem hijack story. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that shortly. So I think we need to try and reclaim the Carpe Diem spirit from these various cultural hijackers and rediscover both its relevance to personal life but also to political life as well. And I think a really good place to start doing this is to think about the meaning of the term, because Carpe Diem can be translated in different ways. So it's traditionally translated as seize the day, but it can also be translated as harvest the day, or enjoy the day, or pluck the day. And I think in Dutch, is it plukken den Tag or something like that? Plukken, yeah. And so these all have slightly different meanings. Some of them maybe sound less aggressive than seizing the day. And in fact, these different translations reflect the fact that Carpe Diem means different things to different people. So in a room like this, you might get some people for whom it's associated with the idea of seizing opportunities that might be lost and disappear forever. Other people might say, oh, Carpe Diem. No, it's not about seizing opportunities. It's about hedonism. It's about sensual pleasures. And then other people still might say, no, Carpe Diem for me is about living in the here and now, a sort of more mindful sense of presence. So in order to think about that more, I'd like you to do something for me. When I give you the signal, but only when I give you the signal, I'd like you just to get into a little pair with somebody next to you or across from you, ideally a stranger. And I want you to spend just a couple of minutes discussing this question. I want you to think of a time in your life when you seized the day, or maybe you failed to seize the day, and I want you to tell your partner about it and talk about what it reveals about what Carpe Diem means to you. So think of a time when you seized the day or failed to seize it, and talk about what that reveals about what Carpe Diem means to you. So is that clear? So on the count of 3, I would like you to blow the roof off this lovely restaurant with your conversations. I know you're going to do it. I know you are. 1, 2, 3, go. Okay, can I have your attentions again, please? Thank you very much. You are not very obedient, but I like that. Okay. Sorry to break up your conversations. You'll have more time for that later, but I need to tell you the next part of the story, really, because I got interested in writing this book about a book about Carpe Diem. It's called Carpe Diem Regained, partly because I was having conversations with lots of people, like the kind of conversations you had, and I kept discovering that so many people had different views about what it meant. So I decided to get a bit more systematic. Rather than just having kind of conversations with friends and so on, or people on the street, I put together a crack research team, and we did a guerrilla raid on Oxford University's Bodleian Library, which is where I live, and we started looking through manuscripts over the past 500 years, everything from newspapers to Reformation church sermons, trying to find out how people have used these phrases, Carpe Diem, seize the day, seize the moment, and so on. And after a lot of research, looking through thousands of original sources, we discovered a pattern. And the pattern is what you'll find on this little card that you've got in front of you, which I call the Carpe Diem mandala. But the main thing we found, and you won't need to look at this as I'm talking, but just now, are 5 different ways humankind has thought about seizing the day over the centuries. The 5 things on the outside there. So one of them I call opportunity, presence, spontaneity, hedonism, and politics. These are all different ways that humankind has discovered to seize the day and make the most of the short life before the Grim Reaper comes along and shortens it for us. And I want to tell you about each of these 5. But the thing about them is that each of them has been subject to a kind of hijacking, which I'm going to talk about as well. So the first kind of seizing the day, the most popular meaning of it is seizing the day as seizing an opportunity to, it could be anything from changing a career to rescuing a crumbling relationship or calling a snap general election if you happen to be a British Prime Minister. And in fact, if you look through copies of the Times newspaper over the past 200 years, 3/4 of the references to the terms Carpe Diem or seize the day are about seizing an opportunity. And it's interesting to think about what that word opportunity means, because it actually comes from another Latin term, which is ob portum veniens, which means coming towards a port. And it originally referred to a favorable wind that would blow a ship into harbor. Okay. So you can think of it as an opportunity as a wind blowing to your advantage. And the question is, are you going to raise your sails and catch that wind? Or are you so worried of being smashed upon the rocks that you never raise those sails at all and you keep them down? I think it's quite lovely to think of an opportunity as this sort of favourable wind, isn't it? Now, the difficulty, though, is that this idea of seizing opportunities, I think, has been hijacked by consumer culture. Just do it has really become just buy it. Seizing the day has become all about Black Friday shopping sprees and their Carpe Diem messaging, like, when it's gone, or buy while stocks last. It's been captured by one-click online buying and that instant hit of gratification it can give you when you press that button. So we're so busy seizing the credit card that we don't really have time to seize the day. But I doubt, though, that Horace would have thought that Carpe Diem was all about getting a bargain down at the Forum. I think we can do better than that when it comes to seizing the day. And the way I do it in the book is I look at different Carpe Diem adventurers or pioneering figures from history who have mastered the art of seizing the day, and sometimes with terrible disasters happening to them as well, because it's not always easy going. And one of the people I write about, and I'll just tell you a little bit more about her, is the African-American writer and essayist Maya Angelou, who died a couple of years ago, age 86. And she's best known as a literary figure, but she's also one of these people who lived with a seize-the-day kind of gusto. She was like a Carpe Diem addict. And even though she's best known as a literary figure, by the age of 40, she was always experimenting, changing jobs, changing lovers, changing countries. So by the time she was 40, she had been a tram attendant, a Creole chef, a prostitute, a brothel manager, a political organizer for Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., a journalist in North Africa, a TV scriptwriter, lots of different things. And crucially, she'd been a nightclub singer and dancer. And she was the kind of person who was always winging it, taking chances. So, for example, in her 20s, she was determined to get a job in show business. And she saw an advertisement for a singer and dancer in a San Francisco nightclub. And she just walked in and said, "I am a Cuban calypso singer and dancer." Even though she had no experience as a professional dancer. She hadn't sung at all since she'd been in the church choir at school, and she wasn't Cuban either. But she did it, you know. I sometimes look at someone like her and think, like, where did she get this capacity to take risks, this kind of courage? And in her case, I think what's really interesting is that she wasn't able to seize the day like Richard Branson or someone like that, who could do it out of privilege, where you can go kite surfing around the world because you're a billionaire. She did it out of a position of poverty. She said, "The birth of my son gave me the courage to invent my life." It was the fact that she was a poor, single African-American mum growing up in the South of the United States that actually, in a way, compelled her to start taking chances, because otherwise there was little chance of survival, really. And eventually, though, it became a habit. So when she got married, it drove her crazy, and she got out of the marriage as quickly as possible. But it wasn't always easy. So when she became a singer and dancer, she got offered a job to travel to Europe in a production of Porgy and Bess, and she had 4 days left to decide whether she would do it or not. And she decided to go. Amazing, Carpe Diem. But she also left behind her 9-year-old son, who was really traumatized by what ended up being a year that he spent away from his mother. So seizing the day isn't always easy. But if you want to try and emulate someone like her, the problem, of course, is that human beings are naturally risk-averse. You know, as psychologists have discovered, one of the great findings of behavioral psychology is that human beings hate losing about twice as much as they like winning, or the pain from a loss is about double the pleasure from a gain. And the great experiment here was done by Dan Kahneman and Amos Tversky, where they got people to bet on a toss of a coin. So if the coin landed tails, you would lose $100. So the question was, what would you have to win when the coin landed heads for you to take the bet? So if it was $100 for a loss and $100 for a win, most people wouldn't take that bet. If it was $150 for a win and $100 for a loss, still most people wouldn't. But if it was about $200, most people on average would take that bet. And of course, it was evidence for them that in certain circumstances, we are naturally kind of risk averse. We'd rather stick with what we know than make change. In Carpe Diem terms, it means if you're suddenly given the offer to go and move to Berlin and start a new life, you're going to focus on everything that could possibly go wrong rather than what might go right, and you may not end up seizing anything at all. So it's worth thinking there about risk aversion. I actually find it quite liberating to know that my brain is probably biased towards seeking security, because then it sort of makes me think, well, it's easier just to shift it back. That's an evolutionary bias that may have had use when we were on the plains of Africa and there was a red berry there that we hadn't tasted, and it would have been we probably shouldn't have taken the risk of tasting it, but we're not in that world anymore. Well, most of us aren't anyway. So that's the idea of seizing opportunities. So let me talk about another kind of seizing the day, which is the idea of presence. The idea of being in the here and now, being in the present moment. Now, something extraordinary has happened in the history of Carpe Diem, is that in the last 10 years, more and more people have started associating seizing the day with the idea of present moment awareness. About 20% of people, according to my research, make that link. Now, historically, this is completely unprecedented. Ask people 100 years ago, they would never have associated Carpe Diem, seizing the day, with the idea of being in the here and now. It was all about seizing opportunities and other things that I'm going to talk about in a moment. So what's happened? Well, where's that music coming from? Oh, can we turn that off? So why are people associating Carpe Diem with being in the present moment? Well, it's basically to do with the rise of the mindfulness movement, which, as you know, is swept across education sphere, health sector, all over the place, mental health, with very good reason, because there's so much evidence, of course, that doing mindfulness practices of various kinds is beneficial for physical and mental health, stress reduction, heart disease, helping you stop smoking, all of that stuff. But when I started researching the relationship between Carpe Diem and mindfulness, I started becoming a little bit skeptical or seeing a few problems. I believe that mindfulness has hijacked Carpe Diem, so just do it has really become just breathe. And I need to probably explain that to you, because probably a lot of you, like me, have done mindfulness courses and so on, and benefited from them. So basically, as you probably know, there's two kinds of mindfulness. There's the traditional Buddhist approach of mindfulness meditation, breathing techniques to bring you into the here and now. And then there's the modern secular form, sometimes called Buddhist meditation without the Buddhism, things like mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which use very similar methods. But sort of two critiques emerged in my research, unexpectedly in a way. The first one was when I went and I had a conversation with this very famous French Buddhist monk called Mathieu Ricard. Some of you might know. In fact, we were in Amsterdam. I was talking to him about a new book of his he wrote about altruism. But I decided just to ask him about what he thought of the modern mindfulness movement. Now, I honestly thought this guy who'd spent 40 years meditating in the foothills of the Himalayas would be a great fan. But he wasn't. I said, why? He said, you know, you could have a mindful, I asked him about the secular mindfulness movement. He said, well, you could have a mindful sniper or a mindful psychopath. You know, he said, you know, really, to be a good sniper, you've got to be absolutely in the here and now, focused in the moment, you know, just non-judgmental, kill people, no judgment. Now, he was kind of half joking, but he was also serious, because he knows that the secular mindfulness courses have become very popular in US military training and in other countries, actually people who are snipers using it, Wall Street bankers getting into mindfulness to keep them calm during high-stakes deal-making. So his point, of course, was that modern secular mindfulness offers mindfulness without morals, that it might be good for you, but it doesn't necessarily make you good. Whereas from his perspective, from the Buddhist perspective, their approach to mindfulness integrates an ethical framework, you know, ideals of compassion, empathy, altruism, care, and so on. So that was one critique I thought was very interesting, that, you know, from his point of view, modern secular mindfulness could be adding more ethics into, you know, like the standard 8-week courses that you do. I mean, Buddhism manages to, so why not the secular courses? And then the second critique I came across of mindfulness, it was the idea that mindfulness is kind of hijacking the idea of being in the present moment. Look, there's lots of ways to be in the here and now, not just through mindfulness meditation. So, for example, through what psychologists call flow experience. That's where you're so engaged in an activity like a high-speed basketball game that all sense of past and future disappears. You're just absolutely in the present moment. You're in the zone. You're in the here and now. And as one of the psychologists called Mahai, who's started doing research on flow experience in the 1970s, pointed out, he said, look, this is very different from a state of sort of calm mindfulness and breathing, etc. Not that one's more valuable than the other, it's just they're very different ways of being in the now. And there's another way. I mean, think of, you know, Maria in The Sound of Music, singing her heart out in the Austrian Alps. It's about exuberance, you know, having a joie de vivre, which brings you into the present moment. You can't stop singing and dancing and so on. Again, very different from mindfulness or from flow experience. Around 6 to 10% of people, some psychologists say, have this natural exuberance built into them. They really can't help it. And then there's a fourth kind of being in the now, which you probably do a lot of, which is collective ecstasy. You go to a rave, you're dancing, there's the pulsating music, and you enter the present moment, almost a kind of a group consciousness, which brings you into the here and now. So I just think that we should be cultivating the different varieties of being in the present moment, not let any one of them dominate, and also we should be not letting mindfulness dominate and capture the whole idea of what Carpe Diem is all about, because there is such a rich historical tradition, like the idea of seizing opportunities, but also the next type I'm going to talk about, which is Carpe Diem as spontaneity. So spontaneity again, a long tradition of thinking that Carpe Diem is all about breaking the bounds, breaking out of the schedule, free experimental living. But the problem, I think, is that this Carpe Diem spontaneity has been hijacked by our culture of hyper-scheduled living and time management. Just do it has really become just plan it. You know, we're so busy filling out our electronic calendars weeks in advance that there's no time left for spontaneous living. We love devising clever time management techniques to deal with the avalanche of emails and tweets and notifications, but a lot of those tips and techniques we use are really just ways to fit more and more stuff in and keep us more, make us more productive and more efficient and more busy, but not really liberate our time. So, but I think, you know, we need to, even though Carpe Diem has been hijacked by that hyper-scheduled living culture, I think we need to remember that our spontaneity has been in decline for a lot longer than since the birth of the digital age. In fact, I think human spontaneity has been eroding on the decline for about 450 years. I mean, if you think back to medieval Europe, social historians say that people lived then with a pulsating, spontaneous aliveness that we can barely imagine today. That of course they were dealing with war and poverty and pestilence and so on, but also daily life was punctuated by moments of Carpe Diem spontaneity. Think of medieval carnival culture in Europe, where peasants would dress as lords and priests in mockery of their masters, where there was, you know, raucous dancing, and even monks would put on wooden clogs and dance the night away. But equally, these were moments of anti-authoritarian change as well. In the Americas from about 1600, carnival time was a time when there were slave revolts. You know, this was a lot of spontaneous action going on in many different ways. But two forces came along and crushed and destroyed that free, spontaneous living that we had in the Middle Ages and the late Middle Ages. The first one was the Protestant Reformation, whereas the sociologist Max Weber said the Puritan aesthetic descended like a frost on Europe. The church started banning carnivals and summer fairs. There were hundreds of laws and other edicts banning public dancing. People used to love dancing in cemeteries. That was banned in many countries. It's true. Cemeteries were great social spaces until about 1600. Banning public games, banning theatre. So that was one thing that crushed the spontaneous spirit. And the other thing was the Industrial Revolution and its greatest weapon, the factory clock. So from around 1700 or so, people started clocking in, clocking out, the birth of the assembly line, people being measured in time and motion studies, a whole new language emerged accompanying the Industrial Revolution, controlling our time, the idea of wasting time, and the idea that wasting time was a sin. I mean, that's an invention of the 18th and 19th century. Certainly in English, that phrase wasn't around before then. And we, I think, have inherited the obsession with efficiency and productivity that came from that age. In fact, just earlier today, I was doing a talk with teenagers about Carpe Diem, and so many of them were worried about seizing the day because they thought that it might encroach on their productivity. You know, that they, you know, because a lot of them, they are studying for exams, I have to admit, but, you know, that idea of being productive, you know, and ticking things off the to-do list is so strong in us. So I think we need to try and challenge it and reclaim a bit of our spontaneity. You know, some people say, oh, you know, I've got a babysitter who's 16 years old, and he says, well, look, if I say I've talked to him about this Carpe Diem stuff, he says, well, I'm really spontaneous. I'm always texting my friends at the last moment saying whether I'm going to come to a film or not, and someone texts me saying, yes, let's go, and I'll come to that party that you've invited me to. But I think that kind of last moment so-called spontaneous texting is really evidence of an epidemic of non-commitment, driven by FOMO, fear of missing out. So many people, especially younger, you know, Generation Y, are worried about they're missing out on all those things going down their Facebook, scrolling down their Facebook list and so on, you know, and something else might be happening around the corner, so they don't make any commitment until the last moment. It's a bit like, you know, when you're at a party and that person you're talking to is always looking over your shoulder in case there's someone more interesting about to come in. But I think we can reclaim spontaneity in more deeper ways than last moment texting. One of my favorite ways is rather subversive, and it's going to sound almost contradictory, which is I like to plan my spontaneity. So I've got a little diary. I don't know if I haven't got it on me here. It's next door. I've got this tiny little diary, and I like doing my spontaneity on a Sunday afternoon between about 3 and 6. So when 3 o'clock comes along, I haven't planned anything, and then I might say to my kids, right, let's go up and, let's go and have a picnic up a tree or do something slightly different. And it seems insane. How could you have to plan spontaneity? But I think the culture of digital distraction and control is so strong that we need to try and develop new habits, and planning spontaneity is one of them. So that's 3 kinds of seizing the day: opportunity, presence, spontaneity, hedonism. Right. Let me just have a drink of unhedonistic water. So hedonism has a pretty bad reputation. People associate it with binge drinking and heroin overdoses. But in the Carpe Diem tradition, it's much more beautiful. And particularly in the 17th century, people tended to associate the idea of Carpe Diem, seizing the day, with hedonism, with sensual and sensory experience, whether it was, free love or gastronomic exploration as you're doing tonight. It was about tasting the world, touching the world, feeling the world. And I think a lot of our connection with hedonism has been lost, and that experiential sensory approach to life has been lost because of another hijacker, which is 24/7 digital entertainment. I think Just Do It has really become Just Watch It. It's not only that we're checking our phones 110 times a day. I mean, the average person is on a screen of some kind for between 7.5 and 10 hours a day. And I think what's really interesting about that is that although people think, oh, these days we're all spending our time, on Twitter or Facebook or video games and so on, that actually the biggest proportion of screen time remains a very ancient hijacker known as television. So the average European and North American watches TV for about 3 hours a day. So that means by the time you are 75, you will have watched TV for the equivalent of 9 years continuously. Okay, 9 years, right? If you add it all up together. Imagine sort of getting to the end of your life and looking back, thinking that you spent nearly a decade watching reruns of TV game shows and things like that. Now, I know that there are wonderful things on television, from nature programs to political shows and so on. But if you're interested in seizing the day, TV isn't the way to do it. If I asked you to seize the day here and now, it's unlikely you'd pick up a remote control and start flicking through the channels, because you know that it's basically a form of passive experience, or not very active anyway. There's a big difference between playing a game of tennis and watching the French Open final on television. So I think we need to try and reclaim or battle against just watch it culture. Now, how might we do this? Well, one way would be through rejecting digital culture, of course. We've all probably tried various times putting ourselves on digital diets. If you come into my house, we ask people to leave their phones in a box in the hallway as you walk in, just like they do in 10 Downing Street. You have to leave your phone in a box if you visit the Prime Minister. So we do that, and a lot of people may have tried to spend weekends without their phone and died in the process. My wife and I, we used to keep our television actually in a cupboard at the top of the stairs, and so to watch anything we had to literally take down this huge television down 2 flights of stairs, but we don't have a TV anymore. So we could be rejecting digital culture, but I actually think a better way to counter just watch it culture is to get back in touch with hedonism. But how might we do that? The way I like to do it is through thinking about a poem, a Victorian poem, so from the mid-late 19th century, a poem called the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Now, some of you may know this poem. It went viral in Victorian England in the 1860s. In fact, its publishing history is really interesting. It was written by an eccentric English scholar called Edward Fitzgerald, based on the verses of an 11th century Persian sage called Omar Khayyam. And it was published in 1859. Not a single copy was bought in its first 2 years. Then it was picked up in 1861 by a member of the Pre-Raphaelite movement, who passed it on to a couple of famous painters and writers, people like the writer and artist John Ruskin, who declared it the greatest poem of the age. It then really went viral. You could buy Omar Khayyam tooth powder, you could buy Omar Khayyam illustrated playing cards. By the time of the First World War, there were 447 editions of this poem in circulation. And in fact, during the war, there were British soldiers found dead in the trenches with copies, little miniature copies of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam in their pockets. And in fact, I have one right here. This actually is one of those. And you're probably wondering what was in this poem. So it was over 100 verses long. So I'm going to just read you just one little bit of it. Then to the earthen bowl did I adjourn my lip, the secret well of life to learn. And lip to lip it murmured, while you live, drink, for once dead, you never shall return. Now just out of interest, can anybody here quote any of the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam? Just by chance? So like 30 years ago, or 50 years ago, probably half of the people in the room could have. So what was its attraction? It was attractive partly because it was about hedonism. It evoked romantic embraces on balmy Arabian nights accompanied by cups of cool, intoxicating wine. But it was also about death. It was a reminder that death could come and take all of us. So savor the exquisite moments, be here in the now before death takes you. But it was also had an anti-authoritarian message. It was an antidote, an outcry against 19th century and Victorian ideologies of, unofficial ideologies really, of moderation, primness and self-control. People like Oscar Wilde loved the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam because it was about sexual liberation, a justification for homosexuality. And I think today it's still really valuable to get in touch with poems like this because, we live in a puritanical age. If you pick up a modern self-help book or a happiness book, it'll never say in the back or anywhere in the pages to deal with your problems by downing a few tequila slammers or smoking a joint under the stars. Yet this is what humankind has been doing for centuries. Now, when the Aztecs arrived in the Americas, when the conquistadors arrived in the Americas, they found the Aztecs tripping on magic mushrooms. Right? What did my children do when they were little? When they would go out into the grass when they were 3 or 4 and they would start spinning, right? Because they were trying to have an altered state of consciousness. They'd spin until they fell over. Human beings love doing this kind of thing. So I think we need to find ways of getting back in touch with hedonism. I'm not saying binge drinking and heroin overdoses or even doing what the writer Robert Louis Stevenson did, who wrote a book called The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 1885 during a 6-day cocaine binge, which I'm quite envious of, doing 60,000 words in that time as a writer. But I don't recommend that. But let's get him back in touch with hedonism. And there's a final form of Carpe Diem, which is political Carpe Diem, which is not a term that you will find in any political science textbook. I used to be a political scientist, a proper one, before I retired, age 33, quite young. But there was no Carpe Diem politics in the encyclopedias of political science. So what do I mean? I think of Carpe Diem politics as its own form of Carpe Diem. It's about mass social mobilization, which is powered by the other 4 kinds of Carpe Diem, which is powered by opportunity, hedonism, spontaneity and presence, but they're taken from the individual to the collective level to bring about political change. So think about the protests which helped bring down the Berlin Wall in 1989. Again, they were full of collective seizing of the day. They were full of spontaneous mobilization. They were complex in many ways. People brought into the present moment. And they were also full of hedonistic revelry alongside very serious political intent. Think also of the gay rights movement which emerged in San Francisco in the 1970s. Again, it's as if they had Horace whispering into their ears. And here it's Pride here this week or tomorrow. And you'll probably see some of that carnival, almost medieval carnivalesque spirit. And I think what's very interesting today, if you look at social movement action over the last 10 years, it's amazing how many of them seem to have that Horace spirit, that Carpe Diem spirit in them. There's some great data I've been looking at recently on the rise of social movement action since 2006, basically mass protests on the ground, grassroots, there's a study from Columbia University across 80 countries showing an constant increase in social mobilization around issues like anti-austerity, failures of political representation. In the last 10 years, there have been over 37 protests, mass protests with over 1 million people on the streets in Chile and France and India. But a lot of them are powered by Carpe Diem. Think of the Occupy movement, which of course emerged in September 2011, spread from Wall Street within 6 weeks to 951 cities in 82 countries. Think of the Podemos citizens movement in Spain, built on the back of the indignados, the indignant ones. But it's also organizations on the right too. The Tea Party was a sort of Carpe Diem activism in many ways, though partly fueled by far-right plutocrats. Also, there were people protesting on the ground, dressing up in 18th century garb with hats with tea bags hanging off them. So I think that, but I think today there's a huge potential for social movements to really draw on the power of Horace. For organizations campaigning against far-right extremism, or in England, organizing to stop a headlong rush to a far-right hardline Brexit, people campaigning on climate change. If they want to be successful, they should be trying to tap into these 4 different kinds of Carpe Diem and taking them to the collective level. In a way, they need to do what the Women's March against Trump, the pink hats, were doing earlier this year. They were shifting Horace in a way from Carpe Diem, the singular Carpe Diem, to the plural Carpamus Diem. Let's seize the day together. So those are the 5 kinds of seizing the day. I'm going to stop in just a moment. But I want to just have a look at those 5 kinds of seizing the day on your sheet there. I just want to have a quick vote, just like a straw poll. I want you to think of one of those 5 which you would like to cultivate more in your life. I just want you to just put up your hand. Okay, just choose one. So you might feel you're abundant in all of them, but try and choose one where you think you'd like a bit more of that in your life. So hand up if you want a bit more spontaneity. That's the one you want. Oh my God, that's popular. Okay, presence, being in the here and now, equally popular. Political Carpe Diem, just the 1, 2. I made that 3.5. Seizing opportunities. Okay, that's probably most popular so far. And who's going to be honest and just say they want a bit more hedonism in their life? A bit of double voting going on. I think that's all right. So in my book, I talk about these 5 kinds of seizing the day. I also talk about these various barriers which you've got in the middle and the existential drives of death and freedom. In fact, here is the T-shirt that goes along with the book. So those are explored much more there. But let me just finish now just with a little metaphor. I wish I could show you this picture. You won't be able to see it very well, but it's this photograph in the book of Giacometti, the Swiss sculptor Giacometti there. And he's actually got his eyes closed and he's making one of his sculptures, the ones where he made them out of bits of clay. And he said something very lovely once. Let me read you this. He said, all the sculptures of today, like those of the past, will one day end in pieces. So it's important to fashion one's work carefully in its smallest recess and charge every particle of matter with life. So the question, how do we charge our own existence with that kind of life? And I think that's where the metaphor is, that in a way we sculpt our own lives, a bit like Giacometti created these sculptures, adding little pieces, little wads of clay, where every choice we make is like one of these wads of clay that creates our own self-portrait. And sometimes we make a major choice, and the sculpture of ourselves changes form or changes direction. Sometimes we don't know what choice to make, and we circle around the portrait, not knowing where to put the clay. Sometimes we put it somewhere and it's a terrible mistake. We're trying to scrape it off or make amends by making different choices around it. Sometimes, we're living a more conformist kind of life, and the sculpture of ourselves starts resembling that of other people. But in the end, I think we can all stand back and look at the sculpture of ourselves and ask ourselves this question: am I really seizing the day and making the kinds of choices that can give this sculpture of myself such energy and such vitality that it might even come to life? Because that is the promise of Carpe Diem. Thank you.